Let me introduce our professor tonight. We are very honored to invite Dr. Eric Hendriks for our seminar. And he is a postdoctoral fellow in the Peking University, and he studied philosophy, sociology, and history in the University of Chicago, UC Berkeley, and University of Mannheim. And our topic tonight is European diversity versus Chinese unity, a region comparison. And Dr. Eric here tonight will introduce and compare Chinese and European democracy from a new sociological perspective. So let's welcome him.
Thank you all for coming to my talk. I'm delighted you all came, given the fact that everyone had to struggle through the most horrible weather to get here. The smog level is reaching records high. European diversity versus Chinese unity, a regime perspective. So why? Yes. In this presentation, I'm first going to outline a new social theory, a new regime theory, which I've developed together with a Swedish co-author. We have developed a new social theory based on a synthesis of ancient Greek political philosophy, specifically regime thinking on the one hand, and contemporary sociological theory, particularly Pierre Bourdieu's field theory on the other. And with this new synthesized theory, we aim to compare the fundamental power structure, the fundamental character of radically different societies. So, in second, I'm going to apply this to the comparison of the European and Chinese regimes. And I'm going to argue that European liberal democratic regime has been marked by a high degree of field diversity compared to the more unitary, much more unitary Chinese regime. And then thirdly, I'm going to comment on China's recent developments, especially the recent the gradual field diversification of China during the last 3-4 decades. So our new regime theory. Let me begin by saying that I'm using the term regime in a neutral sense. Often when you come across the word regime, especially in the Western media, it carries a negative connotation. Western journalists commonly use the word regime to refer to countries they don't like, to countries whose governments they consider illegitimate. That is not how I'm using the word regime here. I'm speaking of regime in the ancient Greek sense, meaning the holistic character of society as deriving from society's fundamental power structure. We believe that every society has a particular regime and that there is a variety of different regime types, one of which is liberal democracy. So regime means the holistic character of society as deriving from society's fundamental power structure. The concept of regime derives from ancient Greek political philosophy. The ancient Greeks used the word politeia. Politeia or regime was the fundamental concept in Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, and the history by the Greek historian Thucydides. In that sense, it is the oldest and original concept of the social sciences. Nevertheless, this holistic regime concept has been forgotten by modern social science. Now, it is important to realize for us moderners that the ancient Greeks, when they used the word regime, were not only talking about politics. Regime was for them as much a cultural and a social concept as a political concept. they meant the holistic character of society. So nowadays, when political scientists say they compare political regimes, they're just comparing the different political systems or the different political fields of different societies. They're not speaking in the ancient Greek sense. They're not comparing the holistic character of different societies. Now this can be a bit, the term itself can be a bit misleading because of course the modern English word politics derives from the ancient Greek word politeia. But this is fairly misleading because politeia, regime, was a holistic concept for the ancient Greeks. And it also meant that for the ancient Greeks, regime dwells as much on the macro as it does on the micro level. So regime is not just about macro level power structures and institutions. Regime is just as much about everyday values, habits, the style of life of ordinary people. So modern political scientists, they compare political institutions, but the Greeks compare the holistic character of society, and the regime dwells as much on the micro level as on the macro level. In fact, the Greeks believe that the micro and the macro are always mirroring each other. This is why, when the ancient Greeks compared the different regime types of their time, militaristic Sparta, democratic Athens, mercantile Corinth, they did not distinguish very much between critically comparing the macro level power structures and institutions of these different regimes on the one hand, and the ethical worth of the typical human being produced by these regimes on the other. So the ancient Greeks distinguished a number of regime types. Aristotle famously distinguished between democracy, oligarchy, aristocracy, monarchy, and tyranny. And if we apply this kind of thinking to our modern world, we can perhaps perceive a number of new regime types with which the ancient Greeks were not familiar. Capitalist regimes, which would be regimes in which business, commerce, commodity is the dominant force. Social democracies, especially in Northern Europe and Scandinavia, which I argue are dominated by the state bureaucracy, not politics, the state bureaucracy. And theocracies, think of Islamic theocracies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran, even IS. Yeah. Aristotle defines regime as the arrangements of society's parts, particularly pertaining to its highest power. So what the highest power, the highest part of a regime is, differs depending on the regime type. So in democratic Athens, it would be the democratic assembly. In Sparta, it would be the military. And if we apply this to our modern world, in the US, it would perhaps be the business elite. In an Islamic theocracy, it would be religion. And in Scandinavia, it may be the state bureaucracy. Now, Aristotle also says that regime is a certain ordering of the inhabitants of the polis, the form of the compounds, and the way of life of the citizens. The German-American philosopher Leo Strauss is one of the few modern thinkers who still champions the classical Greek concept of regime. And he defines regime in the following way. Regime is the order, the form, which gives society its character. Regime is therefore a specific manner of life. It is the form of life as living together, the manner of living of society and in society, since this manner depends decisively on the predominance of human beings of a certain type, on the manifest dominations of society by human beings of a certain type. So we aim to bring this classical Greek tradition of regime thinking into modern sociological theory. And our new sociologized, synthesized regime definition would be the following. Regime denotes the way in which social fields, their prestige systems, logics, and conceptions of human accomplishment are differentiated from each other and hierarchized. The most powerful field corresponds to the dominant and predominant human type in society. Consequently, regime differences between societies are differences in the hierarchization of social fields and the degree and manner in which fields and human types are differentiated from each other. Now, this conception of social fields derives from the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu conceptualized the fact that we can have in a society one macro level power structure, yet within that macro level power structure have plurality, have parts of society being relatively independent from the general power structure. These are fields. Fields are semi-autonomous platforms of alternative power. Examples of fields would be business, politics, science, philosophy, journalism, art, legal fields, military, and religion or the religious clergy. So what is the definition of a field? A field is marked by a relative autonomy from its social environment. Each field has its own semi-autonomous rules of the game, its own internal prestige system and social hierarchy. A social hierarchy based on principles that are unique to the field. So for instance, take science or scholarship, the scientific or scholarly field. If you want to advance your career within this field, you have to work your way up from student to PhD student to postdoc to professor, and then distinguish yourself by publishing scientific articles, going to conferences, teaching, etc. There's a set of principles by means of which you can advance your career, your status within this field. This makes that this social hierarchy is partly differentiated from the general power structure of society. So you can be a prestigious scholar without being, let's say, a powerful politician or a powerful religious leader. However, fields are never completely autonomous from their social surroundings. Fields are always partly heteronomous. Now, heteronomy is the opposite of autonomous. It means not autonomous. So, each field is influenced by outside social logics, which influence its internal status game. So, for instance, in China, if you're a professor with the right political connections, this could further your career in science. In the US, if you have a topic that is particularly marketable, that is particularly business friendly, may also advance your career. So that means that business capital and political capital could further the power positions of players within academia, within science. The more heteronomous a field is, the less autonomous a field is, the less it is differentiated from its social surroundings, from the general power structure of society. So this is a field. At the core of a field stands an autonomous prestige game, a specific autonomous social hierarchy based on unique principles linked to a specific conception of human accomplishment. But there are always outside social forces working upon the field. But some social forces are more powerful than others and have a more powerful heteronomizing effect on the field. So let's imagine that this is the journalistic field in the United States, then a big blue arrow would certainly be business. But if this would be the scientific field in North Korea, then I'm sure that the biggest outside force would be political influence. So, when applying our new synthesized regime theory, which draws on a synthesis of Pierre Bourdieu's field theory and ancient Greek regime thinking, when applying this in order to understand the regime character of a particular society, its holistic character, its fundamental power structure, we have to look at two variables and ask two questions. First, what fields are there in this society? This leads to the question of differentiation. Is religion differentiated from politics? Is the state bureaucracy differentiated from politics? Is business differentiated from journalism? Is philosophy differentiated from theology? And if so, to what extent? And the second would be, what are the power relations between these fields? What is the dominant field in society? This is the variable of domination and hierarchization of fields. So, you're going to have, as I said before, regime dwells on all levels of society, on the macro, the micro, as well as on the meso level. Meso means in between micro and macro. So on the macro level, you're going to see that more regimes that are more field unitary, where fields are less differentiated from each other. You're going to see that on the one hand, and on the other hand, you're going to have regimes which are more field diverse, where fields are more differentiated from each other. And then there is the issue of which is the dominant field. Now, a lot of people assume that politics is always the leading field in society, and especially here in China, it's easy to make this assumption given the fact that China has for a very long time been dominated by the political field. But I argue that this is actually not the case. You can also, depending on the regime type, have business or the military or religion or the state bureaucracy be the most powerful field in society. So for instance, I would argue that the most powerful elite within the United States is not the political elite, but the business elite. I would argue that in a strong Islamic theocracy, the religious elite is more powerful than the political elite. And I would argue that in Scandinavian social democracy, the state bureaucracy is overall more powerful than the political elite. So on the meso level, when you study a particular field, the regime manifests in which outside forces heteronomize the field, and in what proportion. Because the power relations between these heteronomizing forces working upon each field in society reflect the power relations between fields which determine the regime character. So on the micro level, regime manifests in the regime habitus, the everyday habits of people, the style of life, the values. In a more field-differentiated society, social roles will be more differentiated. In a less field-differentiated society, social roles will be less differentiated from each other. So in a society where politics and the state bureaucracy are differentiated fields, the bureaucrat and the politician also represent distinct social roles. But in a society such as China, where politics and the state bureaucracy are not differentiated from each other, the two social roles also blur with each other. And then second, the power relations between fields also manifests in the power relations between human types, between different types of habitus. So in the United States, the business type, I would argue, is the dominant type of human being. So let's look at our world, our contemporary world, and provide a very broad sketch. You would have, in the Middle East, you would have Islamic theocracies, which are marked by low field differentiation, the rule of the religious field, and they would be productive of what I call the theocratic human being. Then you would have liberal democracies, which I argue are marked by high field differentiation and not necessarily by the rule of a particular kind of field. So on the liberal democratic spectrum, you would on the one hand have the United States, which I argue is dominated by business and productive of the economic democratic human. Whereas on the opposite side of that liberal democratic spectrum, you're going to find social democracies in Scandinavia, which are dominated by the state bureaucracy and productive of the bureaucratic democratic human being. And here comes China. China is marked by low field differentiation in comparison to Western liberal democracies. Politics is the leading field, and the regime is productive of what I call the harmonious human being. So, could you give me some water, perhaps? So let's look at the comparison of the Chinese and European regimes. I argue that through hundreds, if not thousands of years, Chinese regime has been more field unitary than Western regimes. And that even nowadays in contemporary China, China is much more field unitary than Western regimes. So what de-differentiates fields in Chinese society, what heteronomizes fields across Chinese society, is of course the dominance of the political field under the leadership of the Communist Party. Under the Communist Party, the political field is a great unifying, heteronomizing force. The politics is heteronomizing fields from journalism, scholarship, to religion, the state bureaucracy, and business. So business, even though it has greatly increased in autonomy over the last 2-3 decades, the Chinese business field is still less autonomous than Western business fields. And you can see this, for instance, when you see that state companies are still a substantial part of the Chinese economy. And as a Chinese businessman, if you have political capital, if you have a strong political network, this can greatly benefit your business career. Now, politics is also greatly heteronomizing religion. My favorite example is the fact that the Communist Party insists on selecting the Tibetan babies, which are discovered to be the true reincarnation of deceased Buddhist lamas. So the Tibetan Buddhists believe that when their religious leaders, their lamas, die, they will be reincarnated. And after a lama dies, they will look for the true reincarnation of this person. But now the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, even though it doesn't believe in this reincarnation process, insists on interfering in this process, which is of course a direct interference in the would-be autonomous prestige game of Buddhism and the Chinese religious field. Now, when you compare Northern Europe and China, the sharpest difference would probably lie in the differentiation of the state bureaucracy and politics. In China, the state bureaucracy and politics are not differentiated from each other, whereas in Northern Europe, they are strongly differentiated from each other, and the state bureaucracy is actually a very powerful field. So in China, you have one career track. You probably start in the youth league, but you definitely have to move through the Communist Party. And then you work your way up to the Central Committee. And the bureaucratic elite of China and the political elite of China are the same people. There's no separate, independent, powerful state bureaucratic elite in China. But in Northern Europe, these are separate career tracks, so to a large extent. So the prime ministers in Northern European countries usually come out of the political field. They start in some youth party and then work their way up in politics. Whereas the top level state bureaucrats tend to come in a completely different way. And not only are politics and bureaucracy fairly differentiated from each other, with the state bureaucracy having its own principles, its own values, in which politics cannot directly interfere. But the bureaucratic elite is actually a very powerful elite. And arguably, especially in Scandinavia, the top-level bureaucrats are actually more powerful than the top-level politicians. No matter how strange that may sound in telling this to a Chinese audience. So China has a very long history of field unity. Through the total politics of Maoist China to imperial China, which was dominated by the central field of the scholar officials. The scholar officials had such a strongly de-differentiating, heteronomizing impact on the Chinese regime, on Chinese society, because the scholar official was meant to represent human excellence in all its forms. The scholar official was the bureaucrat, the politician, the scholar, the artist, the business person, sometimes even the military commander, all at once. And he was supposed to be an expert on everything. Confucian scholar officials, especially during the Ming and the Qing, believed that they were the expert on Buddhism and knew more about Buddhism than the Buddhist clergy. They believed they were the best painters. So when you had professional vernacular painters in China, and they would make paintings which were very good according to professional artistic standards, yet their art was never taken as serious as the art produced by scholar officials. So here you see that the art, for instance, the art field was not able to develop, function according to its own logic, its own internal principles, because of the influence of the central field of the scholar officials. Now, the Chinese sociologist Fei Xiaotong has provided some fascinating illustrations of this. Fei Xiaotong in the 1940s wrote a book on the gentry in Yunnan. And in that book, he sketched out a number of biographical profiles of retired Chinese gentry, many of which were retired scholar officials. And he traced their careers through the early 20th century. And you'll see when you look at their careers that these people were trying to be everything at once. So for instance, we come across the figure of Chairman Wang, who was an official in Yunnan. But was he an official or was he a scholar? And are those roles distinct? They were not. Because at one point we find out that Chairman Wang actually did nothing to the people, for the people. And then Fei Xiaotong asked his informant, I asked my informant why, since Chairman Wang did nothing important for the people, did the gentry elect him, the government appoint him, and the people support him? And then his informant answered, in the first place, he, Chairman Wang, has very good academic qualifications. But he is not only a Confucian scholar, he also graduated from the provincial normal school. Among the older generation of gentry, nobody is better qualified than he. Meaning, academic qualifications can stand in for political qualifications. Then we come across the figure of Commander Chu, the military commander. At one point, he has a big promotion. And in results, his financial situation and the business opportunities of his family radically increase. Meaning that because he advanced in the military hierarchy, his whole family also advanced in the business hierarchy. The clan member of Commander Chu continued. When the news of Commander Chu's promotion became known in our native place, the condition of his family changed completely. Commander Chu's mother was especially proud. When she went to the market to buy something, she purposefully asked the price of this or that. If the salesman knew her and lowered the price, she might buy it. Otherwise, she would ask, "Are your stupid eyes blind? Don't you know who I am?" Commander Chu's second older brother was no longer in great debt because the creditors dared not ask him to repay the money anymore. So the younger brother had been in debt, but the creditors were so afraid of his older brother, who was in the military, that all the debt was cancelled. And then we have Ting the merchant. Ting the merchant starts out as a businessman. He just wants to do business. But he quickly finds out that you cannot get far in business unless you have connections to the central field of the scholar officials. This event, so this is referring to an event in which Ting was forced to bribe a high official, gave him a hint that one who had no connections with officialdom could have no security, even if he had money. He, Ting, had been anxious to get a position in government, in local government, for a long time. Now, contrast this to ancient Athens. In ancient Athens, social rules were much more differentiated from each other. Ancient Athens was arguably the first truly field-diverse society in human history. You could be a major philosopher in Athens without having any political influence. You could be a major politician without having any political, philosophical prestige. You could be high up in the artistic hierarchy and yet not be high up in the philosophical hierarchy, or vice versa. Now there was again a great advance of field diversity in early modern Europe, in the 16th and 17th century in Italy, the Dutch Republic, and then later also in France and Britain. You saw the differentiation of politics and business, the rise of finance and journalism, philosophy differentiated from theology, and experimental science differentiated out of philosophy in turn. Professional art differentiated out of religious art, and you saw the rise of literature. So Imperial China truly has a unique social structure. In the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, when the Western colonial powers came into contact with China, two radically different types of regimes were confronted with each other. So to understand how unique China is, let us first look at primitive tribes. Primitive tribes are field-unitary. There is only one field in a primitive tribe. There's one social hierarchy, and at the top is the tribal boss. You can have different factions within a tribe, but they're not opposing each other based on different value systems, different principles of social distinctions. Rather, they're just fighting over politics or personal grievances. So tribes are field-unitary, but they're tiny. Early modern European nation states are these field-diverse regimes. Now, Imperial China is rather field-unitary, but on a gigantic scale. Geographically, in the sense that the Chinese empire is enormous, but also in the sense that the central bureaucratic machinery of the central field of the scholar officials was gigantic. So China was this unitary, self-contained rock, whereas the European nation states were porous and open. Now these are characteristics which belong together. Because in a field-diverse society where you have all these competing elites, rival elites are going to reach out to make foreign alliances to further their strategic situation domestically. So in Western Europe, based on their denomination, the different religious elites reached out to make foreign alliances in their competition against secular philosophers, secular politicians, and secular businessmen. The philosophers of Britain and the Dutch Republic made alliances. Think of Spinoza, the Spinozists. Think of John Locke, who came to Amsterdam in the 17th century. And of course, the merchants, the rising bourgeois class, had their transnational networks. But if you're a scholar official playing in the status game of Imperial China, you don't benefit from creating a foreign alliance because you're playing in a self-contained game. There's no incentive to create foreign alliances. You don't benefit as a scholar official. There's a fixed set path, career path. How to further your career? You get a higher exam score, or you pass a higher level of exam, or you play politics, or you bribe someone. But it doesn't help your position to create an alliance with a foreign clerical elite, let's say a Hindu elite in India. It doesn't further your position to make an alliance with European philosophers. It's probably not going to make you richer to buy industrial technology from the British. So the social structure, the field structure, China's unitary field structure is the true reason why China and other East Asian societies have traditionally been so closed, and why the European nation states have been so open, but also so porous. Now, it's important to realize that when I say that China is field unitary and it is dominated by the central field of the scholar officials, I'm not arguing that the local level was completely suppressed by the national level. I'm not using the word central in that sense. So nowadays we often talk of China central television, central meaning national. That's not what I'm referring to. Because in fact, if you look at China's central field, especially during the Ming and the Qing, you're going to find that that the local gentry, the local units, had a fair amount of independence. Because you had the central command structure going down from the emperor through the scholar officials. But then the command structure, the central command structure, wouldn't reach all the way to the ground. Fei Xiaotong said about this, we somehow managed to hang up the centralized power so that it did not reach to the ground. So instead of directly ordering the local units, the scholar officials would reach out to a third party, the Shangyao, who would then negotiate with the local gentry. And the local gentry could reject the orders coming from the emperor and coming from the scholar officials. But it doesn't mean that the local gentry were playing in different local fields, because they had the exact same values as the scholar officials, and they were also trying to get their children to pass the central exam system. That means there was one dominant field in Imperial China, but there was an organizational rupture in the middle of that field. So how does field unity versus the Western field diversity manifest itself on the level of regime habitus, the habits, the values, the style of life of the people? Here I'm talking in a very general sense, referring not just to Imperial China, but also to the difference between contemporary Chinese people and contemporary Europeans. The regime, the unity of the regime, of the field unity of the regime of China manifests in an appreciation of harmony versus tolerance, a respect for authority versus anti-authoritarianism, and an insider-outsider epistemology as against a sense of perspectivism. Harmony and tolerance are opposite virtues. Harmony is the virtue of a field unitary regime. Tolerance is the virtue of a field diverse regime. Tolerance is about managing irreconcilable disagreement and lack of respect. It's important to realize what tolerance is because it sounds so nice. Yet tolerance presupposes disagreement and a lack of respect. If you respect someone, you don't have to tolerate that person. If somebody has a perspective that is different from yours, yet on some fundamental level it is reconcilable, then you don't have to tolerate that person. Tolerance is for when you have an enormously field diverse society in which you have different elites, different fields, which are based on completely different sets of values, which are irreconcilable with each other. My native city of Amsterdam and my native country of the Netherlands was in the 17th century known as a bastion of tolerance. because it was a big mess. In Amsterdam, you had different religious groups competing against each other. But they were all trying to turn Amsterdam into the new Jerusalem. Then you had secular emergence, turning Amsterdam into a center of commerce. And you had philosophers such as Spinoza and John Locke, which were turning Amsterdam into a center of what later came to be known as the Enlightenment. Interestingly enough, when foreign visitors came to Amsterdam and they saw this enormously dynamic society, they tended not to like it. Jonathan Israel, in one of his famous works on the Enlightenment, observes the following. Dutch social fluidity, religious pluralism, toleration, and relative freedom of the individual tended to fuel the antipathy to Dutch society frequently voiced by foreign visitors at the time. And those were the same times during those times when foreign visitors went to China, they tended to be very impressed by its majestic unity. So this then also ties in to respect for authority versus anti-authoritarianism. If you grow up, if you live in a field-unitary society, you're confronted with this uncontested order. If you grow up in a field-diverse society, you're going to be facing all these rival authorities, which breeds in people a sense of anti-authoritarianism. How is this? I like to use the metaphor of the parents and the child. If mommy and daddy tell the child that A is good and B is bad, the parents tend to form a unitary block of authority versus the child, vis-a-vis the child. Yet, if mommy tells the child that daddy is an idiot, don't listen to him, and daddy tells the child, mommy is an idiot, don't listen to her, not only is the child now faced with two rival authorities, both authorities also tend to be less authoritative. So, still nowadays, Chinese people tend to have a much greater respect for authority and for hierarchy. So, in a comparative study done by Meyer, in a recent book called The Culture Map, titled The Culture Map, he looked, for instance, at the different leadership styles in organizations, and he compared different countries. And as you can see, China is all the way on the hierarchical side, whereas Northern European countries such as the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden are all the way on the egalitarian side, the anti-authoritarian side. Now, in another comparative cultural study, that of Hofstede, we find the variable of power distance. Hofstede defines power distance as the extent to which the less powerful members of institutions and organizations within a country expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. China has a very high score here, 80. It has a lot of power distance, whereas the US and Sweden have much lower scores. So the US and Sweden are much more anti-authoritarian, more egalitarian, whereas Chinese people tend to have more respect for authority. This then also ties into insider-outsider epistemology versus perspectivism. Now this is about an intellectual habitus. So a sort of particular type of social instinct that is created by people living in a certain type of society with a certain social structure. This is not an explicit philosophical doctrine that is taught to people. So in a field-unitary society, the land's knowledge seems to form a unitary, harmonious landscape. So, but then when you're confronted with an outside perspective, the boundary between inside and outside is very sharp. So if you're a Chinese person who is suddenly confronted with a foreigner commenting on your country, you have a very strong sense of inside-outside. And of course, relating to this is the idea that the insider is the one who knows, whereas the outsider is the one who leads to learn. So Chinese people tend to believe that Chinese people know about China and Western people know about the West. But if you grow up in a more field-diverse society, you have a more perspectival life experience because you're moving through all these different fields and playing all these different social roles. Or at least you're confronted with the existence of all these differentiated social roles. So then, knowledge tends to look more messy, more perspectival. On every issue, you have a multitude of different perspectives. And the outside perspective is just one perspective among many. And you tend to feel that the outside perspective is valuable too, just in a different way. So this may sound very abstract, but you've all encountered this in your own life. If you're a Chinese person, you are probably deeply familiar with the phenomenon of the Uyghur, the Western person, who comes to Beijing, speaks 2 words of Chinese, xie xie and ni hao, and on their way from Beijing airport, they're already making all kinds of supposedly deep observations about Chinese culture. And to you, that person seems extremely ignorant. How could that person feel that just because of this comparative outside perspective, they have any knowledge about China? No. They need to spend a lot of time learning about China to really understand what it's about. They need to be on the inside to understand it. Whereas Western people who come here, especially Western people who have a China expertise, they come here to study, to research a Chinese topic. They tend to be very surprised at first when they find out that their Chinese colleagues at the university don't take their research very seriously. But then a little bit later on, they're equally surprised by the fact that Chinese people grant them with all kind of authority on Western subjects which they thought they knew nothing about. So the habitus traits belonging to a field-diverse regime are actually the habitus traits which underlie liberal democracy. In fact, I argue that field diversity is the true source and foundation of liberal democratic regime. Let me explain what I mean. If people think about liberal democracy, the first thing they think of is elections, because that's what they see on the surface. But then people who are better informed know that democracy is more. Democracy is also about the separation of powers, the 3 branches of government, inclusive and transparent institutions, and about citizenship and the critical public sphere. Yet I argue that beneath this lies field diversity. Field diversity is the source of the public sphere. If you have a field-unitary society, let's say you're a Confucian scholar official in Imperial China, and you have a disagreement with another scholar official, you could play politics, you could turn to a superior, you could bribe someone, but you never turn to the public sphere to negotiate. The public sphere is there for different fields to negotiate exactly because their different social logics are fundamentally irreconcilable. And field diversity is the foundation of civil society. Field diversity produces an empowered civil society. If you have more differentiated social fields, society is more organized and more empowered vis-à-vis politics. Therefore, politics is forced to become more responsive to the needs of society, or more precisely, the needs of various elites within society. Because every field, insofar as it is autonomous, it forms a platform of rival power, an alternative platform of power. Now, in a more field-unitary regime, society is much less organized, and politics does not have the same pressure put on it to be responsive to the needs of society. And this is also the way it played out in Europe historically. In the 16th and 17th century in Europe, in Italy and Dutch Republic, you saw the rise of field diversity. Then in the 18th and 19th century, you got the rise of a critical public sphere and democratic institutions. And then only in the 20th century did you get general elections. So elections are not the core and the foundation of liberal democracy. They're just the top of the iceberg. The true core is field diversity. So now let's look at China's development over the last 3 decades. Because as I've been showing, China has for centuries, if not thousands of years, been more field unitary than Western regimes. But over the last 3 decades, China has significantly moved towards increased field diversity in the wake of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up. So Imperial China had one unitary field structure. It had one dominant central field of scholar officials. But there was an organizational rupture in the middle of that field. Then Maoist China inherited this field empty society. And they took over, they inherited the role of the central field. The Confucian scholar official became the Communist Party Fumuguan, father-mother official. The difference, however, is that under Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party, the command structure did go all the way down. Now, contemporary China, the central field is still enormously powerful and has a command structure that reaches all the way to the ground. Yet, you'll see the rise of semi-autonomous fields alongside it. Business, the military, the legal field. Now, these fields, compared to their Western counterparts, are still fairly heteronomous. Their autonomy is still fairly weak compared to their Western counterparts. But China is already now much more field diverse than it used to be. Over the last 3 decades, we more and more see the rise of an autonomous business elite. We more and more see the rise of a professional military elite. And we see the rise of an empowered legal field. So since I've been arguing that field diversification is the foundation for democratization, China has secretly already been moving to laying parts of the foundation of liberal democracy. There has been a convergence between China and Western liberal democracy in terms of field structure. China has, in its field structure, already been moving towards the field structure that marks liberal democracies. It's not there yet, but it has made very significant steps already. So right now, China is in a sort of hybrid phase. China stands in between 2 regime models. It stands in between the field unitary model of the Qing and Maoist China and the field diverse regime model of Western liberal democracies. And interestingly enough, the fragments from these 2 regime models tend to be placed alongside each other instead of being fully synthesized. I will give 2 examples of what I mean by this. From the legal field and from the military. The old Xinfang petition offices continue to exist. These are remnants from the Qing and Maoist regimes. So you would have ordinary Chinese people going to these petition offices to voice their complaints. Often this would be, for instance, a farmer whose land has been disowned. And they complain to an official. And this official actually doesn't have a legal mandate to help the petitioner and doesn't have any legal expertise to advise the petitioner. That is why a lot of contemporary Chinese commentators say that this system is no longer valuable, that it's dysfunctional. But of course, this is the old model in which politics and the legal field are undifferentiated. However, at the same time, over the last few decades, we have seen the rise of a modern Western-style legal field. This is an import from liberal democracy. You have lawyers, prosecutors, courts, professional courts. The number of lawyers educated in China has grown exponentially over the last 3 decades. And so did the number of laws. The legal field as a whole, even though there's still significant political control, the legal field as a whole has, in the long run, been greatly gaining in autonomy. And of course, this represents a move towards the increased differentiation of politics in the legal field, the rise of a more autonomous legal field. Yet these two systems exist alongside each other. They're juxtaposed rather than integrated. They do not communicate with each other. So they very much symbolize the contradictory points at which the Chinese regime now stands. You see a similar story when we look at the military. In the military, we still have the old buddy system. I call this the buddy system. It's the dual system of military experts and political commissars among the top level military officers. So for each high military officer with a military expertise, there is a military officer whose military expertise is probably not particularly impressive, but who has a political expertise, basically who is there just to check that the other guy is not doing anything that is illegitimate politically. Now this is a Maoist borrowing from the Soviet Union and the Qing. And of course, it represents a model in which politics and the military are fairly undifferentiated fields. At the same time, however, in recent years, we have seen that the military has been professionalizing. And what does professionalizing mean? Of course, it means greater autonomy for the military field. So the military field has become a more professional force with its own ethos and values. And this, again, represents the increased differentiation of politics in the military. So why these contradictory developments? Why do we have fragments from the old regime standing alongside the new regime? Well, of course, because the Chinese Communist Party is facing a dilemma. Its two main aims are contradictory. It wants to maintain political control, yet it also wants to modernize China by professionalizing key social fields, such as the legal field and the military. But in order to professionalize these fields, it has to allow these fields to work more autonomously, according to their own professional principles. But what is standing in the way of that autonomy is exactly the heteronomizing force of politics. Exactly the fact that they maintain so much political control. So these two aims are actually to some extent contradictory. Now, the Communist Party elite realizes this very well. So what has happened is that they've been hesitantly moving towards greater professionalization of fields in China, across Chinese society. So the big trend over the last decades has been towards more field autonomy across Chinese society. But it has been a process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Because where is this all leading? It leads to greater field diversity. It leads to a more empowered civil society. It leads to a more empowered critical public sphere. Ultimately, it may lead to liberal democracy. So I made 3 claims in this presentation. The first is that we have developed a new synthesized regime theory drawing on a synthesis of Greek regime thinking and Pierre Bourdieu's field theory. And we believe that this new framework is greatly beneficial in the analysis of the differences of the fundamental character of radically different societies. And second, I have argued that China has a unique history of field formation. That for hundreds, if not thousands of years, it has been more field unitary than the West, and also more field unitary than India. However, during the last few decades, China has been moving towards greater field diversity, which represents a convergence after centuries of divergence. And since, thirdly, I argue that field diversity is the foundation of liberal democracy, China has already put in place parts of the basic foundation for a liberal democracy. Thank you. Please, questions, comments?
I'm teaching at the Beijing Normal University, and I feel your talk is very interesting to me. And I have one comment and one question. The comment is that, seems to me, is that you intentionally compare different periods of China and Europe, and you try to emphasize the differences.
Yeah.
Let's think about it in another way. If we compare the Europe in the early modern Europe, period, and the China in the so-called warning state period, we can see many similarities, right? And similarly, if we compare China, the Imperial China, with the Roman Empire, with the Byzantine Empire, okay, probably we can also find many similarities. Okay, so in this way, I think the Chinese history is not that unique. The real difference is between political unity and political fragmentation. That's my comment. You can respond to me later. And my question is, how is your theory differentiated from other theories by contemporary scholars? For example, Fukuyama's theory on political order,
Okay.
Which has now become very popular in China.
Yeah.
So I think this is also the question of many of our audience.
Yeah.
For example, another guy whose name is Daniel Bell,
Yeah.
just published a book on
Yes.
meritocracy in China.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
how is your theory different from them?
Oh, very different.
Okay.
Thank you for those for your question and your comments. First, regarding your comments, you are of course exactly right that if we take 2,000 years of Chinese history, we're going to find a lot of variations in specific time periods. And Europe is a large continent, and there were of course parts of Europe which were not particularly field diverse. I have just made a very general observation of the main difference, but I'm very interested in learning more about the subtle variations. Now, the Western of Europe has been overall more field diverse than Imperial China. But of course, Imperial China probably was more field unitary under the Ming and the Qing when the central exam system was fully established than in earlier dynasties. But the work of Erik Zurge, the famous sinologist, shows that already 2,000 years ago, when Buddhism first came to China, it took centuries before the Buddhists were fully accepted in society. And they were only fully accepted after they completely imitated the Confucian scholar officials. That means that already 2,000 years ago, the Confucian scholar officials formed a rather unitary bloc, closed, self-contained system, compared to India, where the Buddhists had been competing against other religious forces, but where there was no unitary political bloc, so to speak, which kept them out. Now, ancient Athens was arguably the first truly field-diverse society in human history. And it was much more field-diverse than neighboring societies such as Persia and ancient Egypt. Now, but the West has had a significant field diversity even through the entire Middle Ages, and also during the Roman Empire. Even during the Middle Ages, you had an aristocracy, which had an aristocratic social hierarchy with its own distinct principles, and you had the church and the clerical elites. And these were two very powerful and partly autonomous fields. You never had even this level of field diversity in Imperial China. And then when the modern era came in, a few societies in Western Europe, so arguably not the entire Europe, but a few societies in Western Europe radically gained in field diversity, making them extremely dynamic, but also rather porous and vulnerable. Because of course there are also immense disadvantages to having a field diverse regime, namely that you lack unity. Regarding your question, wait, could you remind me one more time?
How different is your theory?
Yes. Yeah. So first, figures such as Fukuyama and Daniel Bell, they're the kind of people, even if they quote Greek philosophers, are not speaking of regime in the ancient Greek sense, the holistic sense. Rather, what they're doing is they're comparing different political fields. Now, Daniel A. Bell has just published a book called The China Model, in which he compares the Chinese, what he calls the Chinese regime and Western liberal democratic regimes. But what he does is he purely compares the political organization of one society to the political organization of another. In fact, he doesn't even do that. He just focuses on the selection of leaders inside the Communist Party. So he says, okay, we compare China and Western liberal democracy. Which system produces better leaders? The Chinese Communist Party has the organization department. Western liberal democracy has elections. Which is better? And then I'm saying this is not a fair regime comparison, because liberal democracy is not just about elections. It's about a whole social structure. And the Chinese Communist Party is not just about electing leaders. The top, I'm 100% sure that all the top level officials of the Communist Party are extremely intelligent people. And they're very capable. It's just that the Communist Party in the political field, due to its sheer force in Chinese society, has a structural impact on fields across Chinese society. And this, it doesn't matter how brilliant the leaders are, this structural impact on Chinese society is still the same. So, from my point of view, Bell's regime comparison, and I like Professor Bell a lot. I've met him. He treated me to lunch in Sanlitun. He's a very kind man, and he deeply loves Confucianism and Chinese culture. So I respect that very much. But I feel that his so-called regime comparison is not an actual regime comparison, and it's unfair because it isolates elements out of the regime, whereas you cannot isolate elements out of the regime. The regime is not just one institution, it's all the institutions. It's not just institutions, it's also the people.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Don't be shy.
So actually somehow move towards field diversification somehow in the grid of let's say the party. So somehow it's still I mean in Europe it somehow grows from the grassroots or from the people, from the demo.
Mm-hmm.
But in China it's in the hand
Mm-hmm.
of the state
Mm-hmm.
democratic elites
Mm-hmm.
as well as the political elites who are there at the same time. So how do you think about this?
Well, I think that field diversification. So the question is, where does the field diversification come from? Does it come from the top or does it come from the bottom?
Yeah.
Right? I feel it comes out of the fields themselves. I think that right now Chinese professionals in a variety of fields are just trying to do their job according to their own professional standards and principles. Right? Lawyers in China just want to do their job. Scholars in China just want to do their job. The military professionals in China just want to do their job professionally according to military principles. But of course, it is the great force of politics which is heteronomizing all these fields. So, if the dominance of the central field would step back, it would open more space for greater autonomy of fields in Chinese society. And that is actually what has been happening in the last 3 decades. In fact, the last 3 decades constitute a very radical break with a very long tradition of Chinese fields unity. No? Don't be shy. Yes. Ah, yes. Yeah, very good question. So will this development stop? Yeah, or will it continue? Well, first of all, the future is open. Everything is possible. It all depends on the actions of different players in society, including, of course, the Chinese Communist Party. I think that even if the Communist Party elite doesn't like a move towards liberal democracy, they will, at least in the short term, keep pushing towards more field diversity, because this is their way of modernizing China and professionalizing fields. They haven't discovered any other formula for modernizing China than furthering the autonomy, the professionalization of different fields in China. So I think that the Communist Party right now is looking for other formulas but I haven't discovered it yet.
What do you think the reason that what the obstacles for China to moving forward to reach the level like the democracy level like Europe?
Yeah.
And do you think if there are chance for China to reach the same level?
Oh, absolutely. Like it could, like regimes, like every society and every human group can, in principle, in the long run, adopt any type of regime. So Chinese people could be liberal democrats in 300 years from now, and Western people could be theocrats. And in the Middle East, they could be secular, could have secular politics-dominated regimes. Like everything is, in principle, everything is possible, right? But what you should understand about regimes is they have a great force of inertia. Regimes tend to be very inert because they're such complex power structures that they tend to move very slowly. So even during revolutions, when people actually try to radically change the regime, what often happens after the revolution is that parts of the old regime come back. So Tocqueville famously wrote about the French Revolution. Yes, it changed French society to a great extent, but a lot of elements of the old regime, the ancien regime, returned in a new France. And this always happens with revolutions. So actually, most of the time regimes move very slowly. But Chinese regime has been moving fairly quickly actually, because look at 200 years ago. 200 years ago, when Imperial China came in contact with colonial powers from Europe, they were two completely different entities. On the one hand, you had European nation states, which were field diverse. And on the other side, you had a Chinese empire, not a nation state, an empire, which was field unitary. Now, first in the 20th century, China adopted the nation state model. And now it's moving towards increased field diversity. So China's regime has actually been moving very, very quickly if you look at it from a macroscopic, long-term perspective.
To me, it just seems like the liberal democracy is a model that China has to follow based on the European culture, based on the political.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about the question is there an alternative model that China can choose? Or further question is, can you say something about the pros and the cons of liberal democracy?
Sure.
Are there better models of a regime than the liberal democracy?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that question. So you have two questions. The first is liberal democracy the only option for China? And second is, what are the pros and cons of liberal democracy, right? So, of course, liberal democracy is not the only option for China. There are many different options. It's just that if China, the current regime, the current leaders, or I should say the current leadership of China, owes part of its legitimacy to the fact that they show the Chinese people that they're able to modernize China. And the only formula that they have discovered for modernizing China is by professionalizing fields. And the only way they professionalize fields is by granting them these fields more autonomy. So I think that right now the question you're asking is exactly that question the whole Communist Party elite is asking desperately, because they're looking for alternative ways, but they haven't found them yet. And the fact that you can see that they haven't found it yet from their contradictory policies, right? The fact you still have the Xinjiang system, but also the legal system, that the Chinese Communist Party on the one hand invests in a more empowered legal field, then on the other hand, once in a while, arrests a few lawyers again. It shows that they're hesitant about what they're doing, right? Because they want to modernize China, but they actually don't really want to go to the Western liberal democratic model. It's just that it's not me saying that there is no alternative. It's the Communist Party themselves, which at this point feel that they haven't discovered an alternative. Even though they give slogans, like popular slogans in public, I think that they feel that they haven't discovered a real alternative. Now the second question, pros and cons. There are definite cons and minus points to liberal democracy as well. Because, and there are big pros to field unity. So nowadays when we look back in history and we compare my home country in the 17th century and Britain in the 17th and 18th century to imperial China, nowadays people tend to think that these Western countries were a great success. They were very dynamic and they progressed very quickly, whereas imperial China was a big failure because it stagnated. But during the time itself, as I already told you with this quote during the talk, during the time itself, people who came to China were deeply impressed by the majestic unity of the Chinese Empire. And when they went to Amsterdam, they were not saying, oh wow, this is such a greatly dynamic place, oh look at the field diversity, this is great. No, people were shocked. It was a horrible mess in their eyes. Most foreign visitors didn't like what they saw in Amsterdam. So it wasn't, at that time, it certainly wasn't clear that a more field diverse society is a better society. Because what does a field diverse society lack? It lacks unity. Field diverse societies are always very treacherous society. Already in the time of ancient Athens, the Athenians were known to immediately, everyone, half the city was immediately betraying their city state as soon as conflict broke out. You have the figure of Alcibiades, who constantly kept changing sides in a different conflict. And there was a massive war between Athens and Sparta in which half of the Athenian population was killed. And just a few years later, or just actually during the conflict, you would have philosophers in Athens criticizing parts of Athenian society. You had Aristotle just a few decades later who would praise the Spartan regime, even though the Spartans had slaughtered half the Athenian population and burned down the city. So field diverse societies, because they have so much value diversity, they never close the ranks. My own society, there was I recall an incident that happened just a few months ago, or actually last year, when an airplane, a Malaysian airplane, flew from Amsterdam to Malaysia, was shot down over the eastern Ukraine by a rocket fired by the Russian rebels, right? 200 of my fellow countrymen died in that crash. You would think that everyone would close the ranks, but instead, if I open a Dutch website, half of the contributions were people who were making up conspiracy theories about how we shouldn't blame Russia for this, or the Russian rebels, but we should rather blame the Ukraine or our own foreign policy. Or let's take America, which is an extremely field diverse society. Whatever American foreign policy is, at least a significant part of the American population is immediately going to vilify it. So when America invaded Iraq, after a while, there was a very strong opposition to it. So nowadays, when you go around asking people, what do you think about the Iraq war? The people with the most negative opinion about it are Americans. So this is, of course, the negative thing about field diversity, that you don't have unity even in moments of crisis.
You speak of field diversity, you speak of field India moving towards or shifting towards field diversity, and it's like the assumption is that it's an endgame type of thing. Like, do you think that? Oh, I'm just asking. Like, is field diversity moving? So if we shift the focus to the West, do you see any shifts or changes from field diversity back towards field unity, or
yeah,
a different system altogether?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that question. So is field diversification inevitable? That is actually an interesting question, because there have actually been people such as Niklas Luhmann, for instance, who have been arguing that the differentiation of society is a one-way street to a large extent. Now Bourdieu, the theorist on which I'm building, is not of that camp, and I also don't believe this is a one-way street, because if you actually look empirically, you often see developments in the other direction as well. I think the United States, in recent decades, due to the increasing dominance of the business field, has lost parts of the autonomy of politics. I feel that the trend over the last decades in the US has been towards the decreased autonomy of the political field, to such an extent that, especially on the right, the American right now, having political experience and political credentials almost disqualifies you from being a presidential candidate. Rather get someone from outside of politics because their credentials seem more legitimate, seem more valuable. So that's why if you have credentials in business, for instance, it's or particularly business. You will, that functions as a great form of capital in politics. And at the same time, of course, you have the fact that politicians need money, they need financing from businessmen. So in many different ways, the power of business over the political field in the US is substantial and has arguably been growing. So that could be one of the, or take American journalism. In recent years, also due to the rise of the internet, the commercial market has become more competitive. So more and more journalists are unable to conduct their profession according to professional standards and need to take commercial standards more and more into account. So probably also the American journalistic field has been commercializing, hence losing parts of its autonomy. Oh, yeah, sure. Now perhaps we should do one, because you, yeah.
Have you tried any quantitative methods to analyze what the sizes and what the influences of the fields are in your regime? I mean, how can you estimate the differentiation of the fields in that regime?
Okay. Yeah. So you ask, how can you estimate what the power relations and the differentiation of fields are in a regime? And how could you approach this quantitatively? Well, quantitatively, what I'm very interested in are all comparative studies. For instance, studies from organizational psychology, which give me dates. Which give me numbers on a variety of subjects. So, for instance, Hofstede, which I mentioned, and Meyer, who do these cultural comparisons. That's a great way of quantifying differences in culture, so to speak, or what I call regime habitus. Then how do we see how differentiated fields are from each other and what their power relations are? This will get a little bit complex, but I have a theory. In my theory, there are 5 fundamental sources of power in society. And the different fields in their competition against each other struggle over these fundamental forms of power. That would be the means of coercive violence, wealth, or control over wealth distribution, control over education, the power to write the laws and set the rituals. And the last one, wait, law. There's always one I forget. Public voice, the power to spread your message in public. So I argue that in all societies, these 5 forms of social power, you will find these 5 sources of power. So like public voice in a modern society, that would be who controls the modern media. But even in a primitive tribe, some groups speak more loudly than others. Who controls the education system? Who controls education? Through education, you can mold the future generations in your image. You can determine what is defined as legitimate knowledge. Through writing the laws, you can consolidate as a field, you can consolidate your power position in society. By setting the rituals, you can consolidate your power by drawing symbolic boundaries and drawing symbolic hierarchies which are in the benefit of your structural power position. The means of coercive violence and wealth distribution are obvious. So I argue that if you have a society and you want to know how are the power relations between the fields, you have to look at who monopolizes these forms of power. And if they're shared, who shares in these forms of power and what are the proportions? And so you would have to look at in whose interest are the laws being written. So for instance, right now in the US, just 2 years ago, I think it was, the Supreme Court decided that companies are people too. Companies also have human rights, which greatly increased the ability of companies to influence politics, for instance, via super PACs. So this is the kind of lawmaking which is beneficial to the business field. So if I see this, I say, aha, indication there. Rituals. To study rituals, you need ethnography. Wealth distribution, you can draw on quantitative data. Who has the most money? Who earns the most money? For instance, in Scandinavia, top-level state bureaucrats actually earn more money than top-level politicians. Aha! Who has the money? Whose messages are being spread in public, and who controls the media? So these, you have to systematically go through all these. And then you get, but then you will not get one hint that a certain field is dominant. You will get hint after hint after hint after hint. If you go into China and you look at these 5 sources of power, you're going to find again and again, it's political, it's politics, it's a political field. And in the US, you're going to find again and again, it's business again. Again business, again business, again business. And then you're going to find the same story on 3 levels, on the micro level, on the meso level, and on the macro level, right? Because you're going to see the power relations between the different fields also reflected in which outside forces, which outside social logics heteronomize a particular field.
So what do you think about the Singapore model?
The Singapore model.
And you think it's liberal democratic country, and do you think it's a nice model that China can follow?
Can China follow the Singapore model, and is it a nice model? I argue that China cannot follow the Singapore model because Singapore is not a model. Let me explain what I mean. Singapore is just like China, is in a transition phase, and it doesn't have a consistent model. It's just at a different stage in the same transition. Singapore has, over the last decades, been gradually moving towards liberal democracy. But along the way, people have always been arguing, look, Singapore, it's an alternative to the West. And then Singapore moved more towards liberal democracy. Now Singapore, alternative to the West. And it moved more towards liberal democracy. So how can it be a model if Singapore has just been consistently moving towards Western liberal democracy?